So let's take a look at a want brief. So a want brief is a really easy acronym to remember, and it's a method of out-briefing or briefing just before we walk to the aeroplane to fly to check that we've collated all the information that we need and we're aware of all the threats that may impact our flight. So this literally should take just a few minutes before we walk. So what does WANT stand for? It stands for weather, aircraft, NOTAMs, and threats. And really those top three build on that final one, on the threats of the flight. And that's how I approach each of these when I'm thinking about them. What's the threat on each of these sections that's going to potentially impact my flight, and how might we put things in place to mitigate them? So I'm going to outbrief this flight here. So we're flying from Leeds Bradford to Blackpool via the VRP at Fleetwood, and we're going to have Liverpool as our alternate. So weather's clearly a huge thing that can potentially impact everything that we do in aviation. So it's really worth spending time checking the weather and understanding the weather and how that's going to impact on your flight. So for the purposes of our flight today, we've got a northerly wind at 10 knots. We've actually got a nice sunny day. We've got a few cloud at 4,000 feet, but we have a cold front working its way from the west, and it's going to hit the west coast by 1600 local. So how could that impact our flight? So we're going to depart Leeds Bradford. We've got a northerly wind, so we'll be on the northerly run, and the wind will be straight down the runway, so that won't impact us. Our transit across, we've got a nice day. We've got a few cloud at 4,000 feet. We do need to check the temperature as well, just to see if there's anything in the temperature that would affect us. Today, we've got 20 degrees on the ground. The cold front is working its way in from the west, so we're expecting to be back at Leeds Bradford Airport by 1500 local. But if we get delayed for any reason, then that could potentially impact our flight, so we need to be aware of that. It's a northerly wind, and both Blackpool and Liverpool have fairly east-westerly runways. So the threat there, as we're going into either of those airports, is going to be potentially a crosswind. So we need to be aware of that, and I would be monitoring that particularly as I work my way across. And that'll be a key thing that I'll be listening for on the ATIS as I go into Blackpool, particularly if I'm in the P Mentor with that reduced crosswind limit. In terms of the aircraft, there's a few things that I need to check. I need to check when the next maintenance is due on the aeroplane and whether this flight is going to impact that servicing schedule. I need to check the performance of the aircraft, and I need to check the mass and balance of the aircraft. So for this case, we've got 40 hours to the next service, and there's no acceptable deferred defaults on the aircraft. So there's nothing on the aircraft that's going to affect our flight in terms of maintenance. Performance. So Leeds has more than 2,000 metres of runway, Blackpool more than 1,800 metres, and similar Liverpool more than 2,000 metres. So performance-wise, there's nothing to affect my performance. And then, as I do with every flight, I would carry out a mass and balance calculation for the passengers I've got, the fuel that I've got, and any baggage that I am carrying. And having calculated that, I'm happy with within the envelope for the mass and balance of the aircraft. So I've checked the NOTAMs, and there's nothing in particular to affect. The only NOTAM that could potentially affect a flight into Blackpool is the locator beacon is currently unserviceable. We don't have any plans to use that for this flight, so that's not going to be an issue. And then finally, my threats for this flight. So in terms of the threats, I'm going to think about really what I've just discussed in the previous parts of the brief. So in terms of weather, my two threats are going to be the crosswind at Blackpool and that cold front working its way across. So I'm going to mitigate that by listening to the ATIS and ensuring we're within crosswind limits. And I'm going to monitor that cold front when I'm on the ground, particularly if I get delayed in any way, and to determine whether that's going to impact my flight back to Leeds Bradford later on this afternoon. There's a large section of Class A airspace in between Leeds Bradford and Blackpool, so that's definitely a threat. So the base of that is 3,500 feet, so I don't want to fly into that. I've got a good VFR day, so I'm not concerned about flying below that. But what I'm going to do is bug my altitude as a mitigation, and I'm going to fly across at 3,000 feet to make sure that I maintain separation between the aircraft and that Class A airspace. The highest obstacle on my route is just under 1,900 feet. So I've got a good VFR day, so I'm not concerned about that today, but I'm obviously going to maintain safe separation between the highest point on the ground and my cruising altitude. And that's just to the north of my route. I have been to Blackpool before, but not for a long time, so I'm not overly familiar with the airfield. So that's definitely a threat. I've studied the chart for Blackpool, and I've looked at where I'm likely to be going in terms of taxi route, and I've made a note of that in terms of where I'm expecting to go when I'm on the ground. Again, as ever, if I get taxi instructions that I'm unclear with, I'll come to a stop and I'll have a discussion with ATC to clarify. If I do need to divert to Liverpool, I'm not familiar with the airfield at all at Liverpool, so I've studied the airfield chart as before. The route between Liverpool and Blackpool takes me through Wharton's Mats, and then there's also the Class airspace 3,000 feet and above, and then Liverpool is within Class D airspace. So I will take my time to plan my route down there if I need to do that. I'll use my chart and I'll use the onboard database to ensure that I remain clear of any controlled airspace that I'm not cleared through. And there's my want brief for my trip between Leeds Bradford and Liverpool.